Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for being on time for what is set to be one of the more interesting webinars that I think we're going to all be part of this year. I think that is safe to say. We have had so many messages, so many people are excited and interested about seeing what we have in store today. And frankly, I can't wait. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. And if you haven't done already, I can see that there's already a good few of you who've joined. Thank you for being on time. Please say hello. Say hello in that chat window. And normally I ask people to say why it is that they've joined and what they're interested in hearing about. Should I do that this time? Do you want to say that? Feel free, but certainly introduce yourself. Let us know where you're coming in from. And today is going to be a really interesting conversation. We've had several hundred of you signed up, and I can't wait to get going. So, Trump Pharma. It's an interesting concept, obviously, an unusual concept, and I want everybody to try and have an open mind during the session. I want you to use that chat window frequently now that you've found out where it is, but I want us also, this webinar has, I suppose, a little danger of getting a little heated, and I would wish and understand that everybody in the chat window and in the audience today is going to remain civil and polite. We want healthy debate. We want to hear different opinions, but we don't want to cross that line. So if you could possibly try and respect that, I would be enormously appreciative. But just imagine that a pharmaceutical company was run by Donald Trump. Would he be the ultimate brand CEO? Would he be destructive? And we're going to try and keep today's session relatively politics free. We're going to talk more about Trump, the businessman, and perhaps allude slightly more to his former career than his current one. We did ask you a question when you signed up for this webinar. We asked you, what is playing on your mind thinking about Trump, the leader or business owner? And this is a word cloud that indicates where your answers came. Obviously, far too many to display fully. Interesting words I noticed. On the right-hand side, you'll see the word kiss, which I thought was a pretty unusual one. Yeah, I haven't taken the time to delve into exactly what was said, and I'm not entirely sure I want to. But there we go. That's what you all said in the pre-event. So, Trump Pharma, what the hell is this all about? What could happen? What does a Trump-style leadership actually look like? And probably the most important question is, why? Why would we choose to do this? Why would we put ourselves on the line? Because it's certainly true that I received a lot of hate mail when I was telling people about this event. Probably an order of magnitude more than all of my other webinars put together. And of course, you might recall I ran Musk Pharma webinar at the beginning of last year. But, you know, there were comments from the very straightforward, please just stop emailing me, go away, to complete diatribes. You know, how dare you adopt the Trump voice without any obvious irony? It's serving nothing but legitimizing the man. And of course, plenty of other criticisms as well. But as I said, we're going to try and look beyond some of the obvious stuff, and we're going to try and go into what we would describe as alternative futures. Now, Impatient Health is the company that I founded coming up to 5 years ago. And one of the key things that we believe is that this is not the traditional, mature, rigid industry that we often describe ourselves at. We are young. On an evolutionary scale, as my good friend Brian Smith would say, we are still right towards the left-hand side of a typical etymological chart as the type you can see right now. Pharma is close to the single-celled amoeba, frankly, in terms of its development. We have yet to adapt to the habitats that patients really need us to be in. In fact, it was not only that long ago that you would even not understand which pharma company you were sitting in if you hadn't seen the logo on the front door as you came in. They were all so damn similar. It's only really recently that we've begun to speciate and to actually focus on where we need to be as companies, and we can see certain specialties coming in. And our role at Impatient Health, what we are ultimately trying to do is to speed up that evolution, go from the left to the right-hand side of this graph. And when you think in evolutionary terms, how do you speed up evolution? You speed up evolution by exposing yourself to more mutations, to more ideas, to more potential alternatives. Otherwise, you will never, ever change. And that is exactly what we're trying to do here. We have many potential futures ahead of us, and we need to be able to envisage, to discuss, to agree the alternatives. And one of the biggest issues I believe in our industry is that we don't know what we don't know. We can't see those alternatives. So I make no apology whatsoever for choosing to focus on a man that many of us reject, and for us to be able to look at it whether or not we like it. It's important that there is always a lesson that we can extract, and we always need to embrace that with both hands. We are also going to try and avoid the obvious things. Like when you think of Trump, you obviously see him in the news every single day, whether you're in the US or any other part of the world. But we're not going to be talking about his obvious disregard for scientific fact, for data or other truths. We know that already. We're not going to be talking about the idea of running Pharma like a reality show. And of course, many of you were familiar with his apprentice career prior to him entering politics. We're not going to go on the obvious tricks of blaming foreign pharma prices for everything, which of course we see already today. And we're not going to be focusing on the shamelessness of his self-promotion. Those are, surface level, and we need to dig below that. And what we've actually done, what I've done certainly in preparing for this, is to make sure that I have studied his texts that he wrote or he shadow wrote in his previous career, and to really try and get an idea of how this man thinks. So today we're focusing more on the businessman. We are considering those alternative futures. We're going to try and extract the lesson each time. What is the lesson that can be learnt? And rapid fire. We're going to get through a lot of stuff. There was obviously a huge amount that we just had to get rid of in our plans here. We've decided to focus really on 5 key areas. Now, I would like to introduce a wonderful and brave person. As you can imagine, I wanted somebody to join me for this webinar, and myself and my good colleague, Lorna, we invited definitely into triple figures of people to see who would join us. And everyone ran a mile, whether they support the idea or not. They just didn't want to be associated, with the exception of this man who said that he is never afraid and never will shy away from a difficult conversation. So Richie, thank you so much. Richie, some of you may recall, was deeply embedded in that industry when he was the chief digital officer at IQVIA. And he's got a lot of stints being a technology leader across the financial services industry. Right now, he is pioneering at Mobius, something which you could describe as one of the most ambitious transformations yet, in very much how we actually interface with technology itself. And I very much encourage you to delve into looking at Richie's background to find out more about that. But he is absolutely somebody who, by the way, has had experience working with both Obama and the first Donald Trump administration. And I couldn't wish for a better person. As you can see, his credentials speak for himself. Thank you so much, Richie, for being willing to join this. Now, before we start to question Richie and have a debate going on here, just a reminder, we are recording. We are also live streaming today, very exciting. You don't need to ask me for that recording. You can indeed, we'll send that to you automatically. As I said, if you missed it at the beginning, let's keep it respectful in the chat window, please. And we're going to ensure that, well, I'm going to issue a disclaimer. Richie and myself will be speaking from a personal point of view, obviously not representing our organizations. There's one final thing I want to do before moving on, which is to get you guys to answer a quick poll question. If you look at your screens right now, it should appear in just a moment. I have a 3-part question, which I'm just going to hold open in the background for 5 minutes or so. So you'll be able to answer that at your leisure. You'll see, which of the following do you believe holds pharma back the most today, as the first question. In a pharma company, if a pharma company offered premium services, you would oppose it or question it or accept it, different options there. And then finally, in your view, what is most underutilized by today's pharma CEOs? So I'll let you answer that in your own time, and we'll come back later and look at the results. Okay, couple of quick headline points. I think that if Trump did become part of our industry, you wouldn't be maybe surprised to see headlines like the ones I'm going to show you. Trump Pharma defies FDA, launches people approval platform for accelerated access. And indeed, that is the sort of headline that perhaps would surprise you, probably coming from any other industry CEO, but not from Donald Trump. I think you would maybe see something like Trump RX unveiled, the first branded direct-to-consumer drug platform. We all know that Donald Trump likes to focus on the elite and exclusive, but at the same time paint himself as a man of the people. And trying to cross that divide, I think, is something that'd be very interesting. The first chapter that we're going to talk about in our discussion is what I call exclusivity over access. And what happens in pharma today is that everybody says, let's maximize access. Why on earth wouldn't we say something like that? Of course, we want our medicines to reach as many people as possible. Of course, we want our market to be as big as possible. I think that Donald Trump might be different. I think that he might look for a more phased exclusive access. I think that he might be trying to protect his pricing more. And I think that he might be doing a lot to limit parallel trade. And we saw echoes of that in his current work. And indeed, he would ask, why should we be open to anyone and everyone? Not everyone gets in. Access should be something that you earn. And just some very quick ideas of how this breaks down. Market exclusivity. So, of course, imagining America first launches. Now, yes, America is the standard launch market anyway, but not in the same way, because this would be a very staunchly defiant American first launch where you're pushing that geopolitical leverage publicly and asking for other countries to publicly buy in before enabling it to go beyond. Having exclusivity over the provider network and actually selecting physicians, Trump physicians, shall we say, labeling them as in or out and treating them as brand partners and caring far less about the authenticity and independence of a physician. Lifetime subscriptions or life health subscriptions, premium plans that go way beyond existing insurance plans, focusing on preventative as well as treatment and bypassing the typical insurers like Lilly Direct, but on a much more magnificent scale with rewards for loyalty, status symbols, and elite access. Trump Health City, the idea that he could actually create almost a walled garden for a physical fortress of exclusivity. You can definitely imagine something like that existing. Sort of Disneyland meets Cleveland Clinic, as you can see I've written here, and being certainly media friendly. Platform gating, actually deliberate restriction of access to products or services through a closed and branded infrastructure. That could certainly happen. And then finally, I want to go into this one a bit more. Clinical trials as a premium option. So clinical trials obviously not considered that way at all at the moment, but trial participation framed as a privilege, the right for you to sample something before anyone else. The attempt to position the clinical trials as a luxury service, an early elite access service, and trying to make trials a monetized exclusive as opposed to just purely a sunk R&D cost. Kind of the opposite of DCTs, if you like. People come to the brand rather than the brand coming to the people. But let's make that destination a real destination. So Trump Clinical. I even think you could go one step beyond this. I think you could go Trump Clinical Hotel. And this is an idea, actually, a clinical trial hotel that I had probably 3 or 4 years ago. And I've enjoyed using AI to kind of mock up what it might look like in the past. So a couple of pictures of what I think that could be. But why couldn't a controlled clinical trial environment also become a luxury style environment? And I think that should hopefully pose a few ideas. Why shouldn't it look more like a spa than a hospital? So, Richie, please come back to the screen here. I'm going to get rid of my slides for just 1 second, and let's debate this exclusivity aspect, if that's okay. I'm really curious as to whether or not you think it's believable and how it might manifest itself. What do you think?
Well, usually I would start by saying thanks for having me. And I think I'll say thanks for trapping me. I appreciate that. Look, everything that you just outlined on the slides is sort of happening a little bit right now.
Mhm.
There are many little nuggets of that going on across the pharmaceutical industry. Coming back to the thesis of how could leadership enact change, and what could be learned from different leaders across the organization or across the world, one of the things that I think is important to kind of walk away with is that the nature of leadership is not the same across all organizations. The nature of leadership in pharma is going to be different from the nature of leadership in the financial services industry and different from the nature of leadership in government. And so bringing over some of the government practices into pharma is more of a magnification to be able to extract lessons from it, right? Access is kind of interesting because we think about access as something that have multiple accesses to it, right? There's sort of the fairness of it, right? There's the inclusivity of it, but then there's economics, and economics kind of matter, right? A lot of times when you launch a product outside of pharma, just in industry, you tend to launch with a market, if you're trying that product, that would withstand the risk of trial, or you launch with a market that needs it so bad where you have high margins to be able to take that margin and actually deploy the product to other markets. So I think having a geographic bound or a market dimension bound around launch is usually not a bad thing. Now, using it for political sort of maneuvering or geopolitical maneuvering is where you start to get into crosshairs, right? And I think the mechanics of running a government are very different from the mechanics of running a company. And so using market access for geopolitical navigation is geopolitical navigation is one of the levers that you need as the president of a country, regardless of whether you're president of the US, you're Obama, you're Biden, you're Trump or any other. That's a part of it. And so for leaders in the pharmaceutical industry, what you really want to ask yourself is, how can you navigate this ability to kind of control access in a way where you manage both sides of that? And I would argue that you cannot deprioritize the economics of a company. You just can't, right? You could have all sorts of social agenda that you want to accomplish, and they have to be important, but they have to be an important number two. Just remember this: every company is either dying or growing. That's it. When you incorporate a company on day one, after you pay the $300 to incorporate it, it starts dying right away. Like the next second, it starts dying. So leaders that are leading companies have to prioritize the economics of that company. And if that means market access has to be done a certain way, then so be it. You have to be able to have it before you can give it.
So, Richie, you said that running a company is obviously very different from running a country, but what you also seem to be saying is that there is a lot of lessons that can be learnt from the country situation that could be applied better to business. And we know right back to Sun Tzu, The Art of War, that it does often help to define an enemy and define a them versus us in your attempt to be the conqueror, or in your words, the growth versus the dying company. So, do you think that actually that attitude is one that should be welcomed?
Absolutely. Look, in any company, okay, there is pounds and pounds of evidence from best practices, and I don't know if there's actually academic research around it, that says transformations happen. You can motivate humans if there's a joint enemy.
Mhm.
It's just the way things work within humans, right? Not only are we copycats, we actually need purpose. And so if you want to energize an organization of 70,000 people around something, there has to be something that we're conquering. There has to be a fight inside of it, right? And so setting up these things are very nuanced, right? In government, it's very easy to articulate that fight, right? It's super easy, but it's a much bigger fight. In the corporate environment, you have to find the thing that people are fighting for if you want to transform a company or you want to transform an industry. And that's not always a vision. It's not. A vision is not something that everybody will fight for. A vision is more of what do we see and what do we want to achieve. Sometimes it's fighting for survival.
Yeah.
If you see an M&A transaction happen, you'll see the people that get acquired struggle for that. So I think it's important to highlight that in politics, you kind of need that enemy to be able to motivate people, and you can lift some of that into the organization. Now, the word enemy has such a negative connotation to it. Like, why would we have an enemy, right? Why don't we have some sort of joint outcome that we're looking for? That's because transformation and change requires fight through the entire industry. And one of the things that I think is interesting about Trump, and I think we saw the same thing in Obama, is that they have this founder fight in them, right? This founder fight that comes out. I'm a founder now. I've been a founder for 7 years. Prior to that, I wasn't. There's a fight that comes with being a founder. And in today's change, especially in the pharmaceutical industry, it's a multi-front battle now, right? You've got incumbents with science. You've got your usual competitors that are moving faster. You got governments changing around you. Every CEO needs to be part startup founder. Every CEO needs to find that founder fight. And I think you see it a lot in politics.
Well, we're going to have to move on to the next chapter, but I will definitely say that I am disappointed frequently by the lack of specific vision that we see from leaders in our industry, and I think the consensus people-pleasing attempts that we have towards progress in our industry that frankly doesn't motivate anybody, whether people inside the organization or outside, and could be a far more inspiring if it did perhaps take a more them and us position. I don't think we should shy away from that, as you're saying, Richie. Right, I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to end that poll question and have a look at where everybody got to. So let me just get that up on the screen. Unfortunately, it takes a few seconds. Okay, which of the following do you believe holds Pharma back the most today? Internal risk aversion and governance, interestingly, getting nearly 50% of the vote. I think that speaks quite strongly to what we've just been talking about. Maybe we were influencing that one a little bit, Richie. If a pharma company offered premium services like concierge support, what would be your reaction? Oh, a far more even spread of responses. So 27% say oppose, 32% say flex it, and 20% accept it. Interesting. So a real debate going on there. Would obviously love to hear some further extrapolation on that in the chat window if anyone is so minded to do so. Love to hear from you. In your view, what's the most underutilized by today's pharma CEOs? Interesting. Another spread, but public engagement with dissent or controversy. We should meet the vaccine hesitators where they are, perhaps is what our audience seems to be saying, with just over a quarter of the vote, and then speed, adaptability, and decisiveness another quarter. So I think that was some pretty interesting results. I'll let that come into the future conversation. I do, as I say, want to move on. So we've just done chapter 1. That was exclusivity over access. The next one is known as the madman doctrine. And I am not actually pointing at Trump as a madman here. I know many of you might do. But this was actually a term that was coined during the Nixon presidency's foreign policy approach. And it's basically a strategy of confusion, I guess you could say. So it was actually inspired by a BBC article that came out just 3 days ago, how Trump is using the madman theory to change the world, and it's working, as you can see. And you might recall this quote, this recent quote, "I may do it, I may not do it. Nobody knows what I'm going to do." This was his response to the Israel-Iran situation that we saw very recently. And indeed, we saw that he said that he was going to delay by 2 weeks, and then he took action just 2 or 3 days later. If you read his very first book, The Art of the Deal, on the first 2 pages, he says, "I play it very loose." And he talks about his a typical week in the life of Donald Trump. "The truth is, I'm keeping my options open." This is a man who hates long-term planning. And he doesn't just hate it because it's ideologically wrong. He hates it because he believes that it's actually hurting us. It's producing that rigidity that is actually not very useful. And one thing you'd say about Trump, and certainly in his deal making, is that he is always determined to keep as many doors open at any point along the future that he can. And the more that you plan long term, the more that you create process, the more that you create long-term thinking, the less ability you're going to have to be able to do that. Traditional pharma, of course, thinks stability, transparency are key. And stakeholders rely on that predictability. In fact, it's the credibility that our industry rely on. Donald Trump doesn't mind. In fact, he believes it's an absolute strength to be able to pivot quickly, fast, instantly, even if it is in complete defiance of what he might have said earlier. Unpredictability is an asset. It's a benefit to be counterintuitive. Mixed messages are an advantage, and you can persuade adversaries that you're temporarily capable of anything in order to extract concessions because everything is a deal, as we said earlier. How might this manifest itself? FDA dealings. Sometimes challenge, sometimes embrace, sometimes openly criticize. Maybe all of them at once. Payer unpredictability. Oscillate between aggressive public pricing stances and sudden compromising, making it challenging for payers and HTA bodies to plan any counter strategies. Competition. Litigate patent infringements, make unfounded counterclaims, badmouth the competition, overinflate the traction that you have, and basically get your competitors into a tongue-tied situation because we know that Pharma wouldn't feel very strong in being able to deal with that. Alliance withdrawals. We obviously saw this in both of Trump's presidencies, his public withdrawals from the Paris Climate Change Agreement and from the WHO, etc. And I think that in Pharma, we would see very similar stuff. Immediate withdrawal, he would describe them as, places where cocktail parties happen and little else, and really set a public them versus us against the status quo position. Art of the Deal, I've already referred to his book, but certainly treating every stakeholder as a deal maker. No such thing as a long-term agreement. Fluidity, instability, they are normal, and gamesmanship is the priority. Authenticity, far less interesting. Maverick test cases. Some of you who've seen me talk before have heard me talk about something I call customer leadership, which is basically the idea of throwing out unexpected positions and determining whether or not they should stick or twist by how the public respond to it. So an example of that was build the wall. Build the wall was something that no one had probably thought of. In fact, we know that the figures of people that supported Build the Wall when it first came out were in the single figures, but by the time the election came along, they were well over 50%. So an example there of where an idea was thrown out to see what sticks, and indeed, that's exactly what happened. So that's the madman doctrine, a very rapid fire journey through that is that. Richie, I can see you're raring to go. What is your comment on this?
No, I was going to say, usually I say thanks for having me, and here again, I'm not sure. So let me just a couple of reflections, right? Again, I'm trying to extract lessons. I'm trying to be a part of the advancement of the industry that I spent such a long time in, and I continue to operate in pharma today. Let me start by saying leadership is a very lonely place. Leadership is one of the most lonely experiences I've experienced in my life. I probably can't even communicate, half of what I go through to my wife. And I would argue that if I didn't have the sensibility to know what to say publicly and what not to say publicly, I would say that if there are issues going on today, if one of my team members would ask me, Richie, what are you going to do about this? I'm probably going to say, I may do it, I may not do it. Nobody knows what I'm going to do, including me, because leadership is a very, very, very lonely place. And so, not having the sensibility of knowing what to say and what not to say is a whole different story. I would argue that many CEOs, if asked and pressed on issues, might have an answer like that. Now, having said that, I would go further and say it's not a madman doctrine, it's classic gaslighting. That's the style, right? This is classic gaslighting. And gaslighting is a short-term leadership tactic. And so that's one of the things that's a lesson, and don't do that, right? You could see all this excitement around this ability to have a direct conversation with the consumer. But if you execute it as gaslighting, then you're not doing any good for anybody. You could execute it in different ways. You talked about the wall a little bit, and I think that one's probably worth just not admiring, but dissecting. Look, borders have always been a radioactive conversation from the beginning of time. Okay, what do you mean you're going to draw a line on the land? Are you out of your mind? Like, that doesn't work, right? Nature just doesn't define it that way, and it led to many of our conflicts. what was unique about that messaging style is that everybody's been talking about immigration forever, and it never really materialized in any president really getting, some benefit on either side of it. What I thought was unique was to come up with a solution, no matter how ridiculous it was, but to come up with a solution. And there's a difference between complaining about a problem all the time and it becomes noise and people get desensitized to complaining about a problem, and coming up with a solution, regardless of whether it was a good solution or not. You put your fellowship, all right. Leadership, by the way, came from fellowship. The etymology of the word started in religion, right? If you put your fellowship into a place where it's solution oriented, which is, yeah, why don't we solve the problem? It's a whole different emotional thing. It's a part of that fight that you talk about. And so it was very fascinating for me, highly apolitical. I migrated here around 16. I really don't understand why America is so passionate about politics. I'm still trying to learn that part as I assimilate into the country. But what was interesting for me is as soon as a solution started to arrive, you started to look at the problem differently. And that's a technique that you could use in leadership in the corporation, right? You can highlight a problem. And this is like basic, career management 101, come with a solution. Now, yes, with public media behind it, you were able to advance that, right? So I think this madman doctrine is the radioactive one. It's classic gaslighting, right? But what is unique about it, in addition to solution oriented, is the relationship with the customer. In a presidential election or in a president across the world, whoever you are, the customer is a citizen and the customer votes you in. And I think in order to draw out the lesson, if you're the CEO of a pharma company, ask yourself, if you conducted an election and the patients were the population that would vote you in, would more than half of your patients vote you in as CEO? That's what brings it to in HD. That's how you look at the issue in 4K. And now what's unique about this, which there's another lesson, is you're fired in 4 years. Right? You're fired in 4 years, no matter what you do. Here in a situation, you could get 8, but in Trump, it's 4. So you go into a transformation, you get elected by the board, you come up the ranks, whatever the case is. How did you get there? Who are your stakeholders? How long do you have to do what you have to do? And how big is the job? And sometimes it's going to require tactics like this because it's really fast and it's really big. And that's where every industry is in today.
Thank you, Richie. Some really important reflections there. This audience that is watching right now is being very quiet. Maybe a reflection of the fact that no one wanted to join and no one was brave enough, unlike Richie, to actually join me on the stage here. But we normally have a lot more chat discussion. So I want to hear not just Richie and myself answering these questions. I want to see everyone answering these questions. So do please contribute and be part of this discussion. We are going to have to move on because, we've got so much to get through. So once again, I'm going to try and get my slides up. Okay, so that
Paul,
was
Paul, I want to pause for a
sure.
second. There's a point that I think I was trying to get to on that direct message of the consumer.
Mhm.
I certainly don't appreciate the fact that this particular individual doesn't know how to diplomatically walk a line between what you say publicly and what you don't say publicly. And we can get into that if we have time to back. There's some pros and cons to why you do it, and you can draw parallels in organizations as well. But one of the things that's really important is how a CEO can use their brand and their perch to be able to have a direct relationship with the end customer. Imagine if the CEO of a pharma company had the type of following from the patient population on X or on Facebook or whatever the case may be, and something changed about a drug. Something changed about pricing, something changed about access, and that CEO could tweet that day, and 80% of all patients that are on that therapy gets that information in 4K and can act on it.
Yeah.
That is the lesson. You can actually execute that type of direct messaging. And if you look at Musk, that's how he manipulates capital, because he has a direct relationship with those GameStop traders. Right? He engages them one-to-one. And so from a pharma leadership perspective, why not take the risk of being direct with the patients?
Well, you have provided the perfect segue, Richie, into exactly what I'm going to talk about. And you will have heard me ask that same question that you've just asked many times. In fact, I would argue that our poll again highlights the fact that that direct relationship is the thing that was missing as people in this very audience, our own industry, voting on our own industry in this session, actually appears to agree with you, Richard.
Well, I thought Voss at Novartis, I haven't followed Voss in the last maybe 3, 4, 5 years since I broadened my
He's
horizon.
definitely got a little quieter, that's for sure.
But no, but he was going down that direction,
Yep.
right? Like how do and did it smartly, right? Let me practice internally first with Novartis. Let me see if I can access this direct channel,
Yeah.
right? It's a massive game of telephone. Even if a CEO says red or blue at the top of the chart, by the time it gets 6 levels down, it's actually orange. So that direct access is important.
Well, absolutely, and arguably, Vas got quieter when Novartis's fame and fortune took a turn. So that's the difference, isn't it? Trump is most definitely on always, and is certainly willing to front things even when they're not going so well. But that, as I said, does segue into the next topic: personal risk capital. And you will, of course, have seen a lot about this. Traditional pharma focuses on anonymity. We don't even know who invented our industry's most popular and most impactful products. Any idea who invented them? Which were the scientists? Very few of us know the story. I even find myself educating our own industry from time to time about who the names and faces behind some of the most important scientific breakthroughs actually were. But we love to overanalyze every decision. We spread accountability across committees. Nothing is personal, and we certainly don't have those heroes that I spoke about before. Trump, the individual, is at the center, the named individual. Every decision or process is owned by an accountable person, someone that you can think that you can speak to directly, certainly react to. The leader is the brand, the decision maker, and the risk taker all at once, and that makes them a walking source of narrative gravity. And perhaps if I'd gone a step further, it would have also been exactly what you just spoke about, Richie, in terms of having that megaphone to such a major audience. How would this manifest itself with Trump? It's personal. Leader is an investment vehicle. Every major move is attributed to that leader directly. And when it doesn't work, those public failures can be reframed as acts of courage. We tried and nobody else did. Ride the chaos. Avoid the downside by making others absorb the operational risk, whereas you can put your name on any upside visibility. That name generates gravitas and throwing down the gauntlet. Most people don't actually realize that the Trump empire, as it will, is largely not owned by Trump. It is branded by Trump. And actually, it's other owner-operators behind so much of the so-called Trump ventures. And of course, rejecting the committees, I called it. Taking personal ownership. Reports out and narrative in. Again, a little bit like what I said earlier. It's not that Trump might be unable to understand a report. It's just that he believes that personal narrative and ensuring that everything has a story is so much more important. It's what people can relate to. It's what people can respond to. It can be heroic, outrageous, or redemptive. The data doesn't speak. It may well be truth or lies, but you can speak for the data, and that part of it is absolutely critical. As we've seen in so much of his political work, untouchable or fired. People are either the in crowd or the out crowd. They are, untouchable. They are perfect and magnificent in every way. And all of a sudden, the next day, when it becomes unequivocal that they did something wrong, they are cast aside and given some horrible nickname, of course, and been looking to remove him for weeks on end. So that's, of course, how it goes. But, that means that the loyalists, those who do support him through thick and thin, are idolized. And people are chosen not necessarily for their expertise or their experience, but for their loyalty and even their theatrical and influential potential. It's the reverse of the KOL panel. Commitment is tied to the myth of fearless perfectional conviction, and there's a sense of anti-delegation. Everything goes through the leader, everything goes to the Trump. There's no such thing as a clinical board or an advisory group. The CEO takes the decision and takes the rap, whether it works or not. So, personal risk capital, again, Richie, I would love your thoughts on how this manifests itself and whether or not it's something that our industry should or shouldn't embrace, like the mafia, as I believe someone has just written in the comments.
I'm having so much fun because I have not given any thought to any of these. So these are right off the top of my head. Loyalty is fascinating. I've definitely, and I'm sort of like 49% a builder, 51% a turnaround artist, I think, from a corporate perspective. Loyalty, it has two components to it. There's people loyalty, which is when you want to change an organization, there are people who are going to be loyal to people. And that's a bit of a natural thing that we all understand, right? Family, builds early bonds of loyalty between parents and kids, etc. The dangerous part is process loyalty. That's where the danger is. And you're dealing with the same issue, by the way. People loyalty versus process loyalty, you're dealing with the same problem. And sometimes it's easier to root out people loyalists versus process loyalists. And those are the hardest to root out in change. And so, watching, I think I've been through two CEO changes in massive multi-billion dollar companies. And, one took 6 months to kind of figure out the operating model of the company and who's going to be the new leadership team. And one did it in about 6 days. And the one that did it in the 6 days turned out to be the better leader, the one that was more accomplished, etc. And so sometimes you look at these thorny problems, and your automatic assumption is, okay, it's going to take some time to do this. Not really. You could change your leadership team in 6 days, right? And then process loyalty is also, oh my God, this person has so much institutional knowledge. How could I exit them from the organization because this is going to be a problem? Well, guess what? If that person resigned tomorrow, what are you going to do anyway? Right? So loyalty is something that you really got to study if you're going into transformation. It's just super, super, super important. The other thing is, we're talking about personal risk capital here. I was doing transformation in a large bank, and I was trying to get funded. I was trying to get like $5 million for the mobile program. We were rolling out mobile for the first time, right? First mobile banking app. And I couldn't find a budget because, the operating committee was not where I wanted to be, et cetera. But at the same time, this bank was spending $17 million a quarter sending paper reports to customers, right? Quarterly bank statement, et cetera, et cetera. And all I had to do was just make sure that I was willing to be the one that kept holding up that flag that says, why are we spending close to $50 million a year on paper? And it was such a radical message because, I didn't want to be seen as too green or too liberal or too whatever the case it is. It turns out I got funded for $10 million for that mobility project because I was able to save $50 million, but I had to put my personal capital at risk because everybody else stuck their head in the sand about the fact that we were spending money on paper, right? Paperless ended up becoming a thing. This is over 10 years ago. So you have to know, however, when to put that personal capital at risk. And here's my litmus test. Okay. If your mom is going to be embarrassed by it, don't do it. It's that simple. If your mom is not going to be proud about something that you are doing, or your dad, depending on who you have that type of relationship with, it's something that you're doing, it's a really good, like black and white litmus test right away. And if it's okay, then go out and execute it. Personal capital is a big part of it. At the end of the day, that's why machines can't lead organizations. They don't have personalities.
And they don't have accountability, therefore. And as we have talked about, I mean, I think that there is a certain amount to be said for the full and total belief in an individual to develop and to put whatever they think. I mean, we talk about empowerment all the time, Richie, and we talk about how the human is above the process. To go back to your loyalty types that you described earlier, the human is above the process in every company. Yet somehow, actually, when it comes to it, we do things this way. Our culture is this way. Things are set. We've baked this in. Actually ends up ruling over all, right? And
Well, look, it's what gets rewarded.
mhm,
What gets rewarded in an organization if you go into an executive committee briefing or you go into a quarterly business briefing and you look at the metrics that are being measured at the time when the ELT gets together to look at a business unit or to look at a region, right? The metrics that are being measured are super short term, right? Not necessarily long term. So you can't be surprised if you're the leader of an organization and you want to change something. The most important part of the craft is what are you going to measure? What you measure gets done. And so you've got this sort of like, politics, you've got this situation where you have the perception of power, but no quarter, because you have three pieces of government here in the US that could hold you back, right? And so one of the things that I look at and I think Obama did some of this as well, which is, hey, I have a point of view, and I'm going to go right out to the constituent and put that point of view and circle it in the news cycle right away, because I want to cut down the time and the effort all these senators and Congress people are going to put into place to try to stop me.
mhm.
Right. Because once the narrative gets out, I get less pushback because everyone now realizes that they're going to have to fight the media. They're going to have to fight the public. Right. Same thing with leadership. Right. When you espouse an agenda as a leader, immediately there's going to be some antibodies in the organization, right? Antibodies that are going to start to drum up. But if you make it public and you put your personal capital out and you say it on CNBC and you say it at the town hall and you say it at the World Economic Forum, suddenly the antibodies in the organization are going, no, 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 no. This person is taking it seriously, right? And that's a part of that personal capital. You got to put that agenda out there.
Well, really good stuff, but time is a marching, and I'm sorry to say that. So we're going to move on to the next chapter. That was personal risk capital. Hopefully you can see the slide. We're going to move on to 4, litigation as a strategic advantage. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. Traditional pharma, litigation is an operational threat or a reputational risk. It's the last thing that we're looking for. It's something to be avoided, and when we can't avoid it, we keep quiet about it and we take a cautious approach, and it's essentially a form of damage control. Trump Pharma, litigation is just 101. It's a standard operating tool, it's a branding opportunity, it's a strategic lever, and it gets priced into the budget right from the start. Because being proactive with your legalities and your disputes can shape the media headlines. It's a form of not damage control, but attention control. And interestingly, it's not even anything to do with actually winning any legal cases or even the rule of law. So let's have a quick look at this. Preemptive litigation. File aggressive lawsuits, even on shaky grounds, to extend exclusivity periods, knowing the process will slow competitors. Trump is unashamed at using the court process. And by the way, he also uses bankruptcies very frequently as a way of essentially just a reset button, Control-Alt-Delete on things that may not be working, but just walks away from them. Again, we all think bankruptcy is the worst thing that could ever happen to us. For Trump, it's a par for the course. And interestingly as well, he has now been involved in 3,500 lawsuits in his life. So that shows you the sort of scale at which this is normality for the Trump organization. Frame the rivals, of course, as foreign cheats stealing American IP, and aim for that populist support, which again you can do when you're controlling that narrative. Sue the regulators. He, of course, would not be ashamed of suing the regulators directly. He's been known to do so. He's been known to sue the media. Even as something as minor as a short FDA delay will invite the opportunity to sue, creating that spectacle. Press conferences are rebranded as legal rallies as a war on innovation or anti-patients. Look at what the FDA is trying to do. Countersue to delay. When Trump has sued himself, he flies back very, very strongly with reputational damage, breach of contract, whatever it is. But what he's aiming for is not to win in his countersue. It's about delays. It's about stalemate. It's about being able to then keep the product alive in the market and unashamedly doing so. Law as a pricing signal. Lawsuits become proof of commitment to a cause. This drug is so valuable, it's worth defending. The aim is to rally that public opinion and support. Monetizing the spectacle. It's not just something that should be hidden away. Lawsuits should be live streamed. Branded merchandise, direct consumer donation buttons, crowdfunding on the back of lawsuits. Even as you saw in Trump's most recent, just before he was elected president, in his support crowdfunding for his legal expenses. Becoming the victim, of course. This is also something that he will play. He will also say that they hate us because we're winning. He will play that card where he needs to. And I think that the merchandising is not that hard to imagine. I think that you could indeed see a MAGA-style movement against the FDA or against any so-called expert or independent that gets in the way of what he will say and his narrative as the way to get innovation to patients. So that was litigation as a strategic advantage. Richie, I don't believe that you're a lawyer, but I somehow feel that you've got something to say here nonetheless.
Again, thanks for having me. So happy. I came from a country where there was no concept of rule of law. I grew up in an ex-British colony. When the Brits leave, you have like a 100-year hangover before you figure out everything, right? And I think we take for granted the contribution that laws add to society. The country that I came from, I migrated here at 16. We didn't have the concept of patents. Patent and intellectual property was new to me. I didn't figure it out until about 20 something when I filed my first patent. So the rule of law is what holds the whole thing together. That's what keeps it in place. And I think that when we think about litigation, we always think about it as this kind of like this negative, kind of like nasty thing. But I would argue that most companies and pharma companies are litigating as much and are preemptive about litigating as much as you just outlined. There's a lot of other things that are going on behind the scenes, and it's not always about infringement or exclusivity. There's a lot of that. Just look at the size of the legal team in a Fortune 500 company. And then look at the profit margins of the biggest law firms in the world that provides the support around those legal teams, right? What's different here is how do you use a lawsuit in order to advance a commercial agenda, right? And you remember, geopolitics is a different game. The customer is the citizen. You've got a job you've been voted in to do. You don't have operating charter, but you have the perception of power. So you've got to find tools. Now, who you are inside is going to drive those tools. I don't have an opinion on Trump either way, as you can imagine here. I'm trying to be as dispassionate and as unbiased as I can. But what is the lesson here is you got to be creative in finding tools. You have to be creative in finding tools. In a world where science is changing fast because of data and artificial intelligence, AI is shifting geopolitical power, right? We're post-COVID. We're in the margin compression phase. We're in unpredictable rates. We're in a period of probably the most unpredictable rates movement we've ever seen in this economic period. You got to find new tools. Now, this individual goes off and finds litigation as a strategy, has done it since he was probably 13, right? That's a tool that you use. But the point is that if you're leading a company, you got to find new tools. You have to find the tools of the time, and you have to use them. I would argue that most CEOs in and out of pharma probably use 90% the same tools that have been used for the last 90 years. And that's why transformations fail.
Richie, I could talk about this for about 3 hours with you. We have 5 minutes on the clock, so I'm going to have to quickly move to my final chapter, which is one that I really want to make sure we squeeze in. It's called Calculated Risk and Optionality. And I think it's very important that this is kind of an amalgamation of what we've seen a lot of. Long-term development means long-term commitments. We talked about how Trump likes to be as fleet of foot as he possibly can. Reducing those assumptions and controlling variables is what Pharma tries to do right now. But Trump tries to maximize his optionality, multiple paths to profit, minimal real exposure, pivot without consequence. Risk isn't avoided. It's reframed. Danger is a valuable thing. Certainly, people are afraid of going into volatile markets, but if he's not, that's an advantage. Abandonment is a perfectly legitimate strategy, and surprise is a form of leverage. Let's finally, for this chapter, just see very quickly, I'm going to skip through this fast. Quick flips, much like you can imagine in the property market. No interest in necessarily seeing medicines all the way through to the market. Buy those distressed assets, spend minimally, glamorize and sell them on, and have all of those pre-baked divestment, IPO, or licensing options. Reduce the equity risk. I already mentioned how Trump likes to brand things that he didn't necessarily create, and he's using, of course, his name to be able to extract upside where he can. Momentum. If you were to read his books, you would see that he believes in momentum above anything else as a strategy. So he's creating stuff, and he hates to delay and obfuscate because it kills momentum. So again, no long-term plans, find ways to push forwards. Trials for market tests. What I mean here is don't just use clinical trials as a way of determining safety and efficacy and regulatory efficiency, but use them as determining what is going to drive media interest, social buzz, influencer patients. Trials are for signal generation, even over the actual testing. Multiple options. Take multiple speculative position assets all at the same time. Block, hedge, ensure that, again, no one knows what you're doing, but you are protected in multiple positions. Finally, go loud. When you do have to change direction, you don't do it silently. You do it as loudly as you possibly can. You proudly cancel. You make sure that when you cancel in phase 3, that you do so because it was your conviction that made sure that you were going in the right direction and not the wrong direction at all. So that's the final chapter. Rich, you've got a minute only to really capture your opinion, which
I'll
I
just
realize
touch on the last one. I'll touch on the last point that you made on the bottom right of the slide.
And I'm just going to set a final
Calling
prompt for everyone to do.
Calling out your failure. So we got 1 minute. Calling out your failure and failing spectacularly and celebrating failure and not hiding it is probably the best thing you could do as a leader, whether it's because you want to be more empathetic or human, or whether you want to bring people along in the journey, or more importantly, you want to prove that you can be wrong. And how you handle failure is probably the biggest contributor to how success is going to come your way.
And we all know that a certain Donald Trump sees failure as not even a setback. It's par for the course, and shamelessness is a super.
Absolutely.
And I think that actually, even if we or we feel sick when we see it, some of us would enjoy having that superpower, wouldn't we, Richie?
I'm running a startup right now. Failure is the course. This is my second startup. Failure is the course, because if that's not the course, then why isn't everybody walking the obvious course, right? So if you want to drive disproportionate change and get disproportionate outcomes, you better become comfortable with failure. You better celebrate it. I would argue that you hunt it.
Indeed. Well, guys, thank you for taking this hopefully interesting thought experiment with us. Of course, none of us know what the answer is, but I hope that we've elucidated a few things. I can see a lot of people have given us some high scores in the final poll as well, so I really appreciate that. If you think that this is a conversation that you want to carry on, if you think there are multiple points, remember my little diagram I showed at the beginning, if you think this is something that we should bring to your office even, then that is all possible. We are going to run a counterpoint. I should have probably mentioned this at the beginning. We're going to do Greta Pharma. And of course, that's going to focus on the environmental and sustainable side of what our industry is. So we are definitely looking at both points of the coin, but we are deliberately looking at the extremities to see what mutation, what provocation actually brings us into new forms of thinking. I want to say a massive, massive thank you to Richie. It's not every day that you find somebody who's not only articulate and accomplished, but also willing to, put himself in the firing line in a sensitive period in your company right now. It could have been very easy for you to say no to this opportunity. So thank you so much for doing what others could not and being willing to have this conversation with me. It is hopefully constructive and all for the better. As we said at the beginning, I hope that we're going to see a few of you at our Pharmageddon events. We have the European event, and you've just seen a sneak preview that the US event is going to be in April 15 and 16 next year. So definitely make sure you're holding your hand up for that if this is the type of conversation that energizes you. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been an absolute pleasure. Whether or not you're going to make pharma great again or quite the opposite, it's been a fascinating ride for us all. So have a good rest of your day, and we'll catch up very soon, I'm sure. Speak soon.